Hey everybody, I know I discussed the brouhaha over Carlos Maza and Steven Crowder yesterday, but there's really more to be said about it because I actually do, in a perverse sense, find the whole incident, quote unquote, fascinating because it really gives insight into how these tech companies, which every single day dominate greater and greater spheres of public discourse, it sheds light on how they react to public pressure. And that has all kinds of political implications, has all kinds of civil libertarian implications, and just more generally on the social fabric of the country, it has major implications. So I actually think it is worth putting aside the Mueller insanity for a day or something and actually assessing what went on here. Number one, I think it's really important to point out that Carlos Maza is a professional adult journalist. Now, I know what constitutes journalism is sort of nebulous today. People constantly tell me online, you're not a journalist. It's just like, all right, I mean, if you don't think I'm one, fine. I feel as though I produce, quote, content that could be reasonably construed as journalistic, but if you don't believe that for whatever reason, okay. I mean, I could give you countless examples of even traditional, objective style reporting that I've done over the years. But, whatever you think of me as, I don't particularly care. Either way, Maza has this series of internet videos that he produces for Vox under the ostensible guise of journalism. So we gotta regard him as a journalist. At the very least, he's employed at a major media company, Vox, which is actually undergoing a walkout today by coincidence of its staff because they couldn't reach an agreement with through their union with management for some kind of deal. Whether the two incidents are related, I have no idea. I don't think so, or have no reason to believe so. But it's kind of interesting coincidence. Either way, the guy I think is reasonably put into the category of journalist. I mean, granted that it's a expansive and sometimes questionable category of differing actors nowadays. But the guy, at the very least, he's a professional, in a sense. He's employed by a major media company. He's something like 30 years old. So this idea that we have to treat him as though he requires protection or he has to be shielded from, quote, harassment or abuse is silly. Now, I'm not saying if he's genuinely subjected to violent threats that could compromise his personal safety, threats that expose his private information. I know that there was some of that allegedly where his phone number got out. Obviously, I think that's a different issue. But in terms of people responding vituperatively to his public political pronouncements that are obviously controversial on their face, people who react to that with insults and ridicule are not engaging in harassment. They're engaging in public political discussion that, yes, can get very heated and confrontational, but nonetheless still falls squarely in, typical speech. It falls squarely into the category of typical political speech that anybody who's in the public domain ought to expect as an inevitability arising from them going out in public and making controversial political statements. I do that virtually every day, and literally every day, I get huge amounts of pushback and insults and mockery and criticism and even some praise now and then, but that just goes with the territory of what I've chosen to do as an adult. I'm not a child. And neither is Carlos Maza. And yet, on his viral Twitter thread that kind of precipitated this blow up. Now, apparently it had been brewing for something like 2 years, where Carlos Maza would put out these videos on Vox, and Steven Crowder would mock them. Okay. And Steven Crowder would then, at times mock Carlos for being gay. Now, I wouldn't do that. I think it's stupid. It's juvenile. It's like schoolyard nonsense on Crowder's part. I generally find him to be a buffoon. I think he's unfunny. I think the fact that he has such major stature in online media is a testament to how ridiculous online media is, in the sense that it elevates people who are kind of clowns. Anyway, nevertheless, I don't think that Crowder ridiculing somebody who's gone in public and made provocative political statements is grounds for declaring that Crowder's engaged in some kind of harassment. It would be one thing if Crowder was directing his scorn at, like, some non-public figure. But Carlos Maza has made the conscious choice to become a public figure of sorts by producing these videos and such and tweeting up a storm for Vox, a major media entity. And let me just give you a couple examples of the public political statements that Carlos Maza has made. He routinely accuses people of being white supremacists. He suggested that street violence targeting his political adversaries is justified. And he's further posited that free speech is an obsolete concept and should basically be abolished on the internet. Okay, you could agree or disagree with those contentions. I would largely object to them. But nonetheless, he's entitled to make them. But he's not entitled to then say, anybody who who criticizes me as a result of my making those political statements that are obviously very incendiary is therefore engaging in harassment and should be ejected from the social media platforms because I interpret their criticism to be harassing or abusive. No, that's kind of like, that's baby talk. I mean, that's like a childlike mentality. It's pathetic. I mean, I think Crowder's pathetic in his own way because he's just this buffoonish character who, is not interesting in any way or has no salient political points. But at least he's not, as far as I know, saying that, his adversaries should be expelled from Twitter or YouTube or whatever. That's a different story. Now, if he has done that, let me know. I don't watch his show or follow him that closely at all. But I just think it's so infantilizing for a professional adult journalist working, again, for a major media outlet to go on Twitter and say he needs protection, he used that word, from YouTube against, like, the depredations of Crowder. And he needs, and his appeals to YouTube were characterized by him, by Carlos Maza, as a, quote, cry for help. You know what? If you're so fragile that you're unable to withstand intense criticism online, maybe you should choose a line of work other than being a pundit or a journalist or whoever, where over the course of your daily duties, you're making provocative political statements online. I don't know how many more times I can say it. It's just so absurd that he would then cast the criticism he receives as harassing or abusive to the point that the people who are engaging in that conduct need to be purged from the internet, or at least the main venues where internet discussion takes place, which is the social media outlets. It's insane. But, Carlos Maza, he kept on this beat of his, and he complained enough and loudly enough that, the journalist horde swarmed around him and supported him and said, YouTube, how dare you not do something? Do something is always the cry when, some kind of authoritative or disciplinary action is demanded, whether it's governmental action or action on the part of a private entity. And eventually, YouTube capitulated. At first they said, I'm sorry, Carlos, but after our review, we've determined that Crowder has not violated any community guidelines, quote unquote. And then sure enough, after the outrage kind of snowballed, YouTube reversed course overnight and said, yeah, we had some major policy shift overnight apparently, and it turns out that Steven Crowder actually did violate the guidelines, so therefore we're going to impose some punishment on him. Yeah. Does anybody really believe that? Does anybody believe that they did anything other than cave to the demands foisted upon them by the journalist hordes who were screaming that something must be done to punish Crowder? Come on. In the rationale that they put out in a blog post on this whole incident makes no sense. It's actually they frame it in terms of these just banalities that, are the worst kind of corporate speak. They said Crowder did not violate our community guidelines, but nevertheless, quote, they decided to punish him because, quote, because of the widespread harm to the YouTube community. What harm? What community? Is YouTube a community? Am I part of that community because I sometimes do YouTube videos? I don't want to be part of your community. Anytime the word community is used in a context like this, it's usually just to make these overly vague general statements that mean nothing ultimately, but are supposed to indicate that the corporate entity is doing something that they want to be perceived as virtuous, and politicians invoke that term to do something similar very often. But, the hysterical, mob of journalists and their activist friends succeeded. They often do succeed because the YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and such, they're very sensitive to press criticism, especially criticism coming from what they regard as elite prestige press. So, like, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, CNN. I mean, I'm not saying that I regard those entities as prestigious necessarily, but these companies know that if they get bad press from those outlets, it could have negative repercussions on their bottom line. I mean, shareholders could get concerned, etc. So they take steps to tamp down whatever controversy is raging and minimize whatever damage could be inflicted by that negative press. So they did that here, where they didn't want Carlos Maza to be a thing for much longer, so they capitulated and imposed some kind of, ultimately kind of meaningless punishment on Crowder. I mean, he still has his videos up. It's just that they're not monetizable right now. Maybe that'll be reinstated. Who knows? I don't care that much about Crowder per se. I care more about the arbitrary standards being imposed by YouTube and other tech companies with an outsized influence on our public dialogue that are taken in response to these pressure campaigns waged principally by elite journalists. I don't think elite journalists should be the ones having this ability to exert influence on these tech companies such that the tech companies almost invariably give in to their demands and set policy in this ad hoc, unintelligible way simply so as to satisfy or ameliorate the journalists. That's not how it should work. What the journalists don't understand, maybe they do understand it on some level, but they're oblivious or they have cognitive dissonance. I don't know exactly. But they constantly frame... So, like, Carlos and his friends constantly portrayed him as, like, this beleaguered, oppressed person. Meanwhile, again, I have to repeat, he's employed by a major media outlet. His cultural sensibilities and his political inclinations are totally in line with much of corporate America, and in particular, Silicon Valley. Meaning Silicon Valley is socially and culturally and politically liberal in the sense that they espouse cultural liberalism as just a regular platitude in their corporate philosophy. I'm not saying that they are leftists. That's a bit different. I mean, actually, if you look at the 2016 Democratic primaries, it's actually instructive. Bernie Sanders got wiped out in San Francisco and like Marin County, the affluent parts of the Bay Area, which Hillary Clinton won by huge margins. So they're not raging leftists there. They're cultural liberals who are affluent, and they're sort of in a separate political category. And that mindset infuses Silicon Valley. So that's why they kind of, make themselves out to be these big champions of gay rights and that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying the entire business community in the United States is aligned with social liberalism, but increasingly that is the case, and it's especially pronounced in Silicon Valley. Yeah, there are conservative elements in like the oil industry in Texas and stuff, and Chamber of Commerce and etc. But even them, I don't think care that much about like LGBT issues. In fact, it's in their business interest to be overly, maximally inclusive to LGBT. So, this idea that Maza, as a gay person, is like an oppressed minority is foolish. Has he encountered certain oppressions over his lifetime? I'm sure. And I don't belittle that. But I'm saying in his current role as a journalist, acting in a political fashion in the public arena, what he's promoting is totally in sync with the predominant corporate and cultural ethos of our era. That's just true. But journalists very often lack any cognizance of this and make themselves out to be victims, or that they're this, repressed, marginalized group. And I just don't think that's the case, but that kind of impels them to demand these protections from the tech titans. They can't realize that they are, in fact, culturally ascendant in a lot of ways. And the fact that Trump is president complicates their perception there, or kind of distorts it. Because they're saying, okay, if Trump is president, that means we can't be, how can we be ascendant? Look who's in the White House. Well, yeah, Trump is in the White House. He obviously wields a great deal of power. But the presidency is not the sole locus of power in the U.S. Cultural power resides elsewhere, increasingly in the Bay Area, or in Hollywood and such, and Wall Street. So just the fact of Trump being there isn't sufficient grounds to say that you are therefore not culturally ascendant. Sorry for getting some background noise right here. There's somebody blasting music outside my window. Hopefully they leave momentarily, but if not, that's all right. So what these tech titans have done, especially since 2016, is made every effort to placate the mob. Now, the mob in 2016, 2017, 2018, and I guess even up till now, have been overwhelmingly fixated on Russia, because they say that the social media companies enabled Russia to interfere in the 2016 election by allowing them to purchase ads, for example, on Facebook. So Russia, quote unquote, purchased what Facebook said was around $100,000 worth of ads for over a 2-year period from 2015 to 2017. In order to sow division or whatever in the U.S. That's such a trivial sum, it's incredible, relative to other kinds of spending in presidential elections, that the idea that we're going to fixate on that expenditure for years and years and years just defies comprehension. But Facebook was willing to egg on the delusion, which held that up to be some kind of grand interference scheme undertaken by Russia, which is not the Russian government in terms of who bought those ads. It was the Internet Research Agency, which has, quote, ties to the Russian government, but that always gets oversimplified. But basically what these entities have all done is they've capitulated to political pressure, journalistic pressure, and they've modified their speech regulation procedures to appease the people, pressuring them to be more active in regulating speech, because they don't like the electoral outcome in 2016, which happened to come about as a result of what they say were these nefarious interference campaigns and fake news and all that. So they imbued the tech companies with even greater authority to determine what adults can consume online in terms of political speech. And that is also incredibly infantilizing. Why do I need Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or any of these people to decide for me what I as an adult can view on the internet? Yeah, I guess if you're talking about children, okay, different story. I would probably more say that's the parents' responsibility. But for adults, let me decide what's fake or real. Give me analytical tools where I can assess the information before me and determine whether it's valid. Don't take it upon yourself to withhold information from me on spurious, arbitrary grounds just because you say it's bad somehow or could result in the election of someone you don't like. That's incredibly imperious and annoying. But, Silicon Valley, because they want to, they're looking out for their business interests. They want to forestall excessive government regulation. They don't want bad press. They want to keep their stock prices high. They gave in to these demands long ago and fed into and amplified the fake news and Russian interference narrative. And they've done something similar with these demands for censorship and the need supposedly to curtail harassment. So the only PR strategy they seem to have is just to kind of like lurch incessantly from crisis to manufactured crisis, and create new policies on the fly to satisfy the braying hordes in the elite media who are constantly finding something new and imaginary to complain about. Anyway, I should emphasize that Steven Crowder, I feel, is stupid and juvenile for mocking Carlos Maza in that way. I don't like this idea of just casually mocking people for their sexuality or whatever. At the same time, Carlos Maza has made the fact that he's gay central to his online performance. His Twitter handle is gay wonk. He's always talking about his sexual proclivities online. So if that's what you do and you're a public figure, you got to expect some degree of mockery in return. Doesn't mean excuse Crowder. I think he's a doof. But they're both juvenile and stupid in their own way. They kind of feed off one another. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'm going to link my Spectator piece. Read that. If you enjoyed this content, please consider giving a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Those links are in the description box. I'll also put my Bitcoin wallet address. I keep forgetting to do that. Especially given the events of yesterday where YouTube just kind of arbitrarily decided to demonetize a major creator. It kind of underscores the need to develop alternate sources of revenue that are independent and controlled by me or by the quote creator. And I hate all these branding terms, but I have to use them, I guess. Because you don't want to be at the mercy of these giant corporations which constantly cater to the whims of unethical, horrible people. So yeah, please consider that. When you give me financial contributions, I'm able to plan to do more stuff. So I can do more reporting. I can do travel to go, cover presidential candidates, that kind of thing. But it does require resources. So anyway, I'm going to, the next podcast is going to come out tomorrow, actually, because I delayed it one day just because I wanted to focus on this issue for today and write my piece. But it'll be good, and you'll see it tomorrow. So I will talk to you later.